Climate Fund. So what is the Social Climate Fund? Let's see, right, I'm terrible using PowerPoint. So what is the Social Climate Fund? The Social Climate Fund is a key EU financial mechanism that's designed to mitigate the negative socioeconomic impacts of the emissions trading system so ES2 expansion. So ES2 is set to launch in 2027, and this will introduce carbon pricing in the transport, heating, and cooling sectors. So what are the impacts of this for householders? So homes that rely, for example, on fossil fuel for heating, so gas, oil, coal, will likely face higher energy costs, making heating more expensive. Low income households, especially those in poorly insulated homes, will be impacted. And there will be an increased urgency for energy efficiency improvements, better insulation, heat pumps, and so on. But of course, as we know, upfront costs will be a barrier for many households. In terms then of transport, the impact will be most likely the cost of petrol and diesel will increase. And as we know, people in rural or suburban areas with limited public transport options will bear a heavier burden. Um, so if fuel and energy costs rise too quickly without adequate compensation, what we're likely to see then is that social pushback and resistance to climate policies. And of course, this is most likely amplified by the current cost of living crisis that many householders experience. So, to prepare for this transition as a result of the expansion or the introduction of ETS2, the Social Climate Fund was established by the relevant regulation, which I've cited on the slide. The fund will come into operation in 2026, and it was established to provide targeted support to those vulnerable households and small businesses that are affected by the rising costs that I've just mentioned. So, member states may use the Social Climate Fund to support structural measures and investments in energy efficiency, renovation of buildings, clean heating and cooling, renewable energy, and so on, and low emission mobility solutions, zero emission mobility solutions. But member states can also use some of the funds on temporary direct income supports. Just to add as well, so to finance these measures and investments in support of the most vulnerable group, the Social Climate Fund pooled revenues from the auctioning of allowances from the ETS2, as well as I think 50 million in allowances from the existing EU emissions trading scheme. Member states are required to co-finance with a mandatory 25% contribution to their social climate plans. And then so that overall, then what we see is funding of at least 86.7 billion across the EU that will be available over the period 2026 to 2032. So, I mean, there has been some discussions about whether or not this is an adequate fund in terms of its size. Um, but I suppose this is a very important opportunity to mitigate the social costs of climate action. And it's important to add that the Social Climate Fund is not just a compensation mechanism, but it's an important opportunity to reduce inequality and break the cycle of fossil fuel dependency. Um, so what's really key here is that this is a targeted fund. The European Commission have been quite strong on this. So it's really targeting those households in energy poverty, transport poverty, and micro enterprises as well, such as small businesses. You know, think of your corner shop, for example, where there is a focus on mobility and buildings, and where there is a direct impact as a result of the ETS2. So the identification of target groups is key. In addition, it's important to add that it's those groups that are already in energy poverty or may find themselves may find themselves entering energy poverty or transport poverty as a result of ETS2. The regulation, so the Social Climate Fund regulation, does provide definitions for energy and transport poverty. That's in the regulations. So the funds, again, are really targeted, quite a strong emphasis on where the intersection between energy poverty and transport poverty meet, and quite a strong emphasis on supporting people who are already in socioeconomic marginalization, for example, because of race, gender, ethnicity, perhaps their citizenship status, disability, old age, or, for example, particularly large households. Just then, in terms of what member states are required to do, so as Ciara already mentioned, by the 30th of June, member states, including Ireland, must submit a national social climate plan to the European Commission. So 30th of June, it's really just around the corner. So those social climate plans must compile all the existing and planned measures that will draw upon the Social Climate Fund. So the plans need to detail the structural measures and the investments that member states plan to implement between 2026 and 2032. The plans will need to outline how the resources drawn down from the Social Climate Fund will be used, and what programs those resources will be applied to for that period to address the social and distributional impacts of rising fossil fuel prices. Member states, as I mentioned already, there is a mandatory requirement for 25% co-financing from member states. That needs to be front-loaded as well. And there is a big emphasis on those long-term kind of structural solutions as opposed to kind of short-term temporary measures. Importantly, then, the Commission assesses the plans that are submitted, and they are assessed on 4 principles. So relevance, effectiveness, coherence, and efficiency. What do these principles mean? So just very briefly, in terms of relevance, the Social Climate Plan needs to be aligned with the overall objective of the Social Climate Fund. There needs to be that focus on vulnerable households, micro enterprises, and transport users. There needs to be a focus on clearly reducing the adverse social impacts of carbon pricing. And then there needs to be a reflection of specific and regional needs as well. So that comes under that relevance, principle of relevance. In terms then of what the Commission means by effectiveness, the Social Climate Plan will need to demonstrate a high likelihood of achieving the intended objectives of mitigating the social impacts and reducing energy and transport poverty. So what we will need to see are well-designed measures, clear targets, performance indicators, timelines, and there needs to be kind of a clear pathway towards stated social and climate benefits, such as access to cleaner transport, energy efficiency upgrades, for example. In terms then of coherence, and Ciara mentioned this already at the start, the Social Climate Plan will need to be internally and externally consistent with other EU national policies, such as, for example, the territorial just transition plans, recovery and resilience plans, and of course the national energy and climate plans. And we know from Ireland's submitted national energy and climate plan last year that there was no mention at all of the Social Climate Plan or the Social Climate Fund in Ireland's NECP. So therefore, it was not even possible to determine whether or not there was consistency between both. So just as well in terms of the kind of consistency, coherence, there needs to be alignment as well with kind of national energy and climate policies to avoid overlaps or contradictions. Efficiency, then, the social climate plan needs to demonstrate cost effectiveness and ensure that resources are used in such a way that maximize the benefits relative to the costs. So what they mean there is just in terms of the allocation of resources, a fair balance between those temporary direct income supports and then the long-term structural measures that are needed to break the cycle of dependency on fossil fuels. Just then, in terms of the process, I suppose with the national energy and climate plans, there was this kind of process of feedback being provided by the European Commission. I will state that I'm not entirely sure if it's the same with the social and climate plan, but there is the Commission does evaluate the plans before any payments are made from the Social Climate Fund to member states. They stated, for example, explicitly on the Commission website that payments are subject to member states' satisfactory fulfilment of a set of milestones and targets in relation to the implementation of the plan. And member states are required, obviously, to implement, and importantly, they are required to also monitor the plan as well. I mean, the fact that it is very much a targeted fund and that needs to be reflected in the plan. I think what's important for all member states, including Ireland, is to get a good sense of where those national vulnerabilities are when designing what needs to be in the plan. So that requires understanding national patterns, regional patterns of vulnerability, and being very clear in terms of where and whom and to whom the measures need to be targeted, how progress can be measured and evaluated, and so on in terms of the effectiveness of those measures. Just to add, the Social Climate Fund regulation is very clear and accessible in terms of the scope and the objectives of the measures and the need for tailored measures as well. Having said that, the responsibility does lie with member state governments in terms of monitoring, implementation, and evaluation. So, as per the Social Climate Fund regulation, what needs to be in the plan? So, obviously, public consultation, which Alison will run through. We all know early and effective public and inclusive public consultation is key here. We didn't see it with the National Energy and Climate Plan. I'll update you in a minute in terms of what we know is happening with Ireland at the moment. But just to add, we haven't yet seen any information about a public consultation plan for Ireland's social climate plan, despite the June deadline being on the near horizon. So yes, of course, needs to be early, effective, timely, inclusive public consultation. And then, of course, the social climate plan needs to include a summary of stakeholder input and how that input has been integrated into the plan's development. We also then need to see, as directed by the regulation, new and existing national measures to address the burden on households from the ETS. Two, there needs to be a strong focus on structural solutions, as I mentioned, and a strong focus on the inclusion of relevant local and regional kind of targeted measures. Member states must ensure that their social climate plans comply with the do no significant harm principle as required by EU funding regulations. Just to add, we are expecting the European Commission to provide technical guidance to what this means and what this looks like within the context of the Social Climate Fund and the plan. They held a consultation on this, I think, last August. So that guidance, I'm sure, will be published quite soon. Also required in the plan, again, is that emphasis on green investments priority, so the prioritization of those long-term investments over kind of temporary direct income supports. As well, then there needs to be included an estimated impact assessment of the effects of ETS2 on energy and transport poverty, taking into account national and regional specifics. As this is very much a targeted fund, we also need to see in the social and climate plans an estimated number of what is the vulnerable household profile, what is the transport user profile for those that are most vulnerable, those that are most at risk, and then an insight into the process and application of the SEF definitions for energy and transport poverty as provided in the regulation. We also need to see then the total implementation costs, including that 25% co-financing contribution that's mandatory. There needs to be a clear justification for the measures that are included. And just interestingly, and this is something that we'll need to watch for, measures that are included cannot be a replacement for existing budgetary financing. So really the financing here is for measures that are additional and not measures that are already kind of financed under existing national budget financing. The criteria for recipient eligibility also needs to be made quite clear, as well as explicit targets, milestones, and an implementation timeline. And as mentioned, then that consistency piece with the NECP and other relevant directives. So that diagram is, I've just copied that from a resource, which I'll mention at the end of this session. But essentially it outlines or it shows the funding limits that the regulation sets on a number of on kind of the direct or temporary direct supports, and then on those green long-term kind of green investments. So within the social climate plans, for example, there is a funding limit of 37.5% on those temporary direct income supports. There is a funding limit of, I'm just seeing here, 2.5% on technical assistance. And then the bulk of funding is around those green investments, long-term investments. As well, there is an emphasis on including supporting services such as those kind of one-stop shop services, strong targeted education campaigns. I don't have a figure for whether or not there is a funding limit on those kind of supporting services, but it is important just to highlight that that is something that needs to be included in the plan. So overall, I think the effectiveness of the process and the policy hinges on ensuring meaningful, early, inclusive public participation and engagement. Those really kind of targeted measures and investments over temporary relief measures. And then, of course, what that 25% co-financing contribution kind of looks like. So I'm conscious of time. So what do we know so far? So that just what I've gone through just gives you an overview from the kind of the EU perspective in terms of what is the fund, what's required of member states. What do we know so far in terms of where Ireland is at, given that the June deadline is just around the corner? So I make a very quick Google search, revealed to me that the then Minister Ryan was asked about the timeline for the public consultation in July 2023 within the Dáil, and he responded by saying that the plan will build on measures from the 2022 Energy Poverty Action Plan and the National Residential Retrofit Plan. The plan will also include a redistribution of carbon tax revenues, and in terms of public participation, what we'll see is the use of platforms such as the National Dialogue on Climate Action for that public engagement piece. Now, of course, important to note that this is from July 2023, so I imagine that this may have changed, maybe not. Just to add as well, in their assessment of Ireland's draft National Energy and Climate Plan, the European Commission were quite critical of the complete absence of any reference to the social climate plan in Ireland's NECP. So they identified a lack of governance details in terms of how the social climate plan will be kind of drawn down and so on. They also identified the incomplete process for drafting the social climate plan, and they identified no clear methodology for identifying those target groups, so the beneficiaries. They recommended that Ireland, as part of the social climate plan process, that they strengthen the measures to address energy poverty and social inequality, and that the SCF, so the Social Climate Fund, is used effectively to support households, micro enterprises, and transport users. So, what do we know? So, in EGNI, we got in touch with the department in January, and we were informed that we were informed that we will be informed about the public consultation. So we don't have any information yet about the timeline around that public consultation. And we were also informed that the plan is in the early stages of development. And that's all the information that we have at the moment. So that's it for me. I mean, just to wrap up by saying there are a number of useful resources. The European Commission has published a number of technical guidance documents to member states. So they have a guidance document on public consultation. They also have one on cost-effective measures that could be included in the plan. And as mentioned, we're expecting one as well on the application of the do no harm principle. Friends of the Earth International have also published quite a useful resource. The regulation itself is quite accessible. And there are another, I think WWF as well, have also published some useful resources. And as Ciara mentioned, we will circulate a briefing which cites these resources if you need the direct references. So I'll stop sharing there, and I don't know if we want to do questions now or maybe after, Ciara.
Yeah, I think if we let Alison do her bit on public participation first, Alison, if that's okay. And then what we'll do is do questions at the end because there might be an overlap in them anyway. Is that okay with you, Alison? Perfect. Right. Well, we'll hand over to Alison now. And thanks, Catherine. That was great. Thank you.
There we go. So can everyone hear me okay? Great. So good morning, everyone, and thanks, Ciara, for organising this, I think, very timely webinar on the Social Climate Fund plan. And I think Catherine has laid out really well the complexities that are involved in this plan, and therefore kind of, set it up extremely well to show the kind of the complexity of trying to do public participation on a plan like this, because it is so wide-ranging and so in-depth in terms of like top-down societal and granular measures that need to be covered in the plan. And with that, it's going to be really difficult to do, genuine and effective public participation on this plan. And we've seen the debacle that happened with the NECP. We've seen kind of like lots of examples of ineffective public participation in climate plans. And it's not for kind of, in some senses, it's not for want of trying. I mean, there are some excellent mechanisms for public participation in climate policy that are set up. They're just not joined up to the plans that then are produced by the policy pipeline at all. For example, like the Youth Climate Assembly, which is a really good example of kind of deliberative democracy in action and public participation, intergenerational justice. But then the outputs of that didn't inform the NECP in the slightest, and there's no mechanism for them to do that. And that's disappointing for, I suppose us as public participation advocates, but also for the people who put their time and energy into those processes, which then goes into a filing cabinet. So with the public participation in the Social Climate Fund plan, we hope that we will see something different. And I suppose I tend to be kind of cynical when it comes to public participation, because I've seen so much bad public participation, so much tokenistic public participation, and so much dodging and ducking and avoidance of public participation by government departments, that I do tend to expect the worst. But in this case, I suppose what's different about this compared to the NECP, and I think it's really significant, is the fact that it is tied into the performance of this creation of this plan is tied into accessing considerable sums of money for the Irish economy. So I think that is considerably more motivating than being seen to do good in climate on the EU or worldwide stage, which is, kind of generally speaking, the only motivation that is offered for participating well in the NECP process. And because there are no meaningful consequences really to not doing your national energy and climate plan well, the Commission do an assessment and they tell you you're very bold, and then you go back the next time and you try and do it better. And they rarely take infringement actions on the basis of failure to comply with the technical requirements of the NECPs, or they haven't to date. And that's obviously part of another EGNI project where EGNI are advocating for the Commission to do just that. But there's, so far that hasn't happened. So we can hope for better, I think, performance in the at least the putting together of the social climate plan, and that we will see kind of greater public participation as well, because it is a core obligation. Now, what concerns me about it is, let me see if I can get my slides to change, is the way in which the obligations are staged up in the regulations. So if you read Article 5, it says member states shall submit a plan to the Commission following public consultation with local and regional authorities, with representatives of economic and social partners, with relevant civil society organisations, with youth organisations and other stakeholders. So, like, public consultation with local and regional authorities is the executive consulting with itself. And we saw a lot of this with the National Climate Dialogues. So when the National Climate Dialogues were started in Ireland, they initially only consulted within the public service and occasionally brought in experts from the outside. And that was gradually broadened out to include civil society organisations. But the National Climate Dialogues are by no means a kind of or in no genuine sense are they a public dialogue open to the public. And this obligation in the regulations staged up as a similar type of kind of closed consultation, which I find kind of concerning because it doesn't comply with the EU's international obligations under the Aarhus Convention, the ESPID Convention, to give the public a say in the making of plans and programmes and in theory policies, but that's never been implemented at EU level or domestically. So what you see here is a selection of stakeholder groupings, not the public at large. So it doesn't explicitly say you have to go out and consult with the public, but so we need to drill down then to see, is there actually an obligation to hold any public consultation on this at all, or is it all just stakeholder consultation? And I'd argue there's very strong legal frameworks in place underpinning this piece of law that do require actual public consultation in addition to stakeholder consultation. So they can't just go and talk to like a couple of local authorities and then some civil society organisations and say they've done their stakeholder consultation and that's the Article 5 obligation fulfilled. So when you look at what the rest of the article says, so it says it should conduct the consultation in accordance with the requirements of Article 10 of Regulation 2018/1999. Now, I'm not a big fan of cross-referencing like that for legal obligations. But what that does do is patch us into 2018/1999 is the governance regulation of the Climate and Energy Union. So that's the one that creates the obligation to make the national energy climate plans and long-term strategies. And Article 10 is the public participation provision of that, which is much, much stronger than the public participation obligation in the social climate fund regulation. So that patches us into, if I can get my slides to change because they've been a bit misbehaving. So this is Article 10 that's sort of drawn in there by that reference. And that requires the public is given early and effective opportunities to participate in the preparation of, and that's the draft energy and climate plans. But obviously, they've referenced the process here of public participation. So one can argue these obligations apply also to the social climate plans. And it also, there's this much debated provision here in Article 10 that the Directive 2001/42 EC is applicable and consultation should be undertaken. 2001/42 EC is the SEA Directive, Strategic Environmental Assessment Directive. So that's a directive that it's a cross-cutting directive that across all plans in all areas that have significant effects on the environment must be subject to a fairly, in-depth consultation, environmental assessment and consultation process, analogous to the EIA process that's conducted at project level. So that means you have to do a draft environmental assessment report, which, so I suppose if I skip to that bit, what the SEA directive requires is a draft strategic environmental impact assessment report. And that report should explore all meaningful alternatives. Now, this is something that, like, in the context of a very complex and very detailed plan like the Social Climate Plan and the NECP as well, it's a challenge to say, how do you fulfill the requirement to explore alternatives? So, like, I mean, we've always argued that this translates to an obligation to explore different pathways to meet the targets that are sought to be met, and alternative pathways to achieve the targets, and that you have to assess the environmental impacts of the respective choices. So then what you're putting out to public consultation is a draft report that presents the public with various choices and the consequences of those choices in environmental terms, and the public are then supposed to give their feedback on what they think is the best choice. Now, what's always happened to date has been there's an environmental impact assessment report of only one option put to the public, and the public are expected to give their input on that. And usually the reports are unintelligible. The data that underpins them is dubious and very hard to parse. And in most cases, they don't genuinely actually, flesh out any impacts at all of the choices that are set out in the plan. And there's no options given, there's no meaningful alternatives given. There's not been any litigation on that point that I'm aware of, but in the context of very detailed and complex and sprawling plans like NECPs and social climate fund plans, but that might be something that we see kind of coming to the fore now, particularly with climate taking on a kind of more human rights dimensions with the recent ECHR judgments as well. I think that gives a more fundamental rights strength to the public participation obligation, because you have your public participation rights in kind of terms of international norms around public participation as a fundamental right strengthen the more your fundamental rights are impacted. And in the case of climate plans like the NECP and social climate plan, your like the actions or failures or decisions taken around climate mitigation and adaptation are now recognized to fundamentally impact on your human rights. So that gives a sort of greater strength to argue in that. So that might be something that we see kind of emerge from the litigation in the next few years. So hold a public consultation on the draft SEA. So that's not specified in the Aarhus Convention what a public consultation is. It's not specified in the SEA directive, except to say the public should be entitled to make comments or submissions and observations on the document, and that those inputs have to be, the decision maker has to show how they were taken into account, and they have to explain in depth how they were taken into account. It has to be conducted early when all options are open and still on the table, and in order to be meaningful. And then, as Catherine referenced earlier, and then you have to ensure the public are fully informed in order to enable them to participate fully. So they have to be given all the information that they need, and different publics require different information. So like expert stakeholders might require the really detailed calculations on which your document is based, whereas the general public might just require an outline of what the policy decisions are that are being made. So, a lot of the time it's argued that the public don't need, to say the calculations on which and projections are based, but in fact, the public is composed of everybody, including people with expertise and people without expertise. The public is not just lay people. The public is the whole gamut of all the stakeholders listed in Article 5, but also everybody else in society as well. And public consultation should enable all those different levels of the public to participate effectively in the making of these plans. And so, what we've seen to date usually is just a kind of a draft plan is issued, and there's no kind of meaningful engagement with that plan, and it's not usually provided in so the plans are usually, or the draft plan and the draft environmental assessment of that plan, there's only one option given. They're usually given quite late in the process. Not much time is given to parse complex documents if we go on the NECP experience, and there's no or very little support given to the public to understand what the environmental impact assessment document means and what the plan itself means as well. There's no plain English summaries provided usually. There's no multi-language versions. There's no like a system of stacking. Like you could have a system of stacking recorded webinars that gradually explain in more and more depth what this process is all about for people, so they could sort of self-educate as the public consultation process goes along. And when you do, the process in a truncated way, like happened with the NECP, we saw the draft was filed with the Commission, then the SEA came out with the draft plan that had already been filed. You had your public consultation, and it was like a 6 weeks to parse really complex documents. And it's not like it. So like it should be a longer and more discussion orientated process. Like I was looking at material on the public consultation processes in France yesterday, and they provide for like really long time frames for complex plans, like 6 months, with very clear and specific requirements to hold public debates and different types of engagements with the public. We don't have that type of structured public consultation. We still default back to the notice on the website or the site notice if it's a project or a plan, and then you're posting your comments, and then the report comes out. And that's our kind of standard method of public consultation. And we haven't really developed our public consultation practices in the public service to a high degree. Our public consultation guidance document for the public service is very, very sparse in terms of detail. And the Commission helpfully have issued a best practice guidance document to give guidance, and it gives really good examples of best practice gathered from the NECP experience from all the 27 member states. So that's really good, and it gives kind of examples of like different types of e-participation and different types of written participation. But arguably that document also lacks imagination and could be much more ambitious in terms of the types of approaches and resources it explores and recommends to member states. Like, I mean, leveraging AI should be like a no-brainer for offering people access to this type of information now. Like an AI, chatbot that's trained on the data from the NECP that allows you to speak with the plan and interrogate it, but in plain English, would be a really cost-effective way to engage the public. And we don't see the use of those tools at all yet in the space, and that's kind of disappointing. Because also beyond AI, there's a lot of other digital tools that could be used and information technology that have existed since the 1980s that could be used to really kind of engage the public much better in this, like holding a webinar, for example. But like you need more than one on a large scale plan like this. You need a very kind of like intensive and staged process of capacity building with the public. So there's no real intention with these plans generally to capacity build the public to be able to engage. And generally the view is the public really, I think that underpins that is a view that the public don't have anything useful to say about these decisions, these large scale decisions that are being made about society. And I think that's disappointing, and I think it underestimates that the capacity the public do have to make meaningful contributions to public policy. So I'll leave it there.
Thanks so much, Alison, and thanks again to Catherine. So what I'm going to do now is stop the recording. Thanks to our presenters, and then we can have a few moments for questions.